Pleasure.
Just before we get into how much or otherwise his MPs are supportive of him and the general public, you are somebody who's known for his speech making, the powers of your oratory. Did you feel for him when he lost his way, when he was literally lost for words in that speech, or did you just think, you nincompoop?
No, I thought there was something wrong, as it happens. Anyone of his experience in his position who goes dry for 20 seconds, for that was how long it was, and repeating over and over again, forgive me, there clearly is something wrong. And the statement from Downing Street that there is nothing wrong with Boris Johnson is really not the kind of statement you want Downing Street to be issuing. Imagine you're a fine and experienced broadcaster. If you forgot your lines for 20 seconds, even though they're actually written and in front of you, you'd be worried, and so would your employers.
Mm. I would say, though, George, this has happened to me once. 20 years ago, end of a long day broadcasting. I think it was the foot and mouth crisis. And it'd been fine all day, but, hadn't had much sleep the night before, baby crying in the night, etc., etc. And there was a moment where I answered a question. I was a reporter at the time, and I just, there was a slight out-of-body experience, probably not 21 seconds in duration. I think I eventually just said, look, would you mind putting the question to me again? So it can happen to people, and I resolved at that moment that I'd do what Winston Churchill did. I'm not comparing myself to him for a second, but it happened to him. He was in Parliament, he was halfway through his speech, he lost his way, and he was mortified. He sat down to jeers and catcalls all round, and he resolved in that moment that thereafter he would always make sure a little piece of paper with 3 or 4 words written on, just so he could always look down, and I'll go in that direction. And that's what I've done since. So there are tactics and techniques if you want to have them.
Well, there are, and someone like him, with all his expensive education and long political experience now, ought to be able to fill in the gaps. I myself never read anything in a speech, and never have. But I would be capable, if I lost my way, of extemporizing, of ad-libbing in a way that wouldn't have taken me down to Peppa Pig land. Now, I'm a big fan of Peppa Pig, Julian. Like Colin, like you, I have to do a lot of Peppa Pig reading in my life with 6 children. But I would have found a more suitable byway to take the audience down than that one. No, I do think there is something wrong. He is losing his grip.
Do you think in any way, I'm going to try and take a charitable perspective on this, do you think that it may have reflected a certain disdain for business, which he's shown before? He was the man who, in the context of the Brexit debate, said, when asked about business, well, F business. And I just wonder, there was a little bit of him just showing his disdain for people who are probably, quite a few of them, quite puffed up and quite pleased with themselves. And he was showing, actually, I don't think you're worth all that much.
Well, that may be so, and I might agree with him, but that would be unwise. And it's, as Mr. Macmillan said, not one damn thing, but one damn thing after another. And it's alienating section after section of his voting base, which is dangerous. And of course, it's exactly 31 years since the defenestration of Mrs. Thatcher. I was there in the building when it was happening. The Tories are ruthless when it comes to protecting their own seats, because those seats are pretty valuable, as we know. You can earn a lot of outside wages from that seat. And if they begin to feel that the ground that Boris Johnson was quite largely responsible for conquering is now in danger of being lost, then I think they will ruthlessly deal with him, even more ruthlessly than they did with Mrs. Thatcher. Don't forget, she was the great she-elephant. It seemed impossible to believe that the Tories would turn against her. But this night, 31 years ago, they did. So I do think that Boris Johnson is in trouble. It's hard to imagine, isn't it, that Mrs. Thatcher would have allowed thousands of people every week to be landing on our southern beaches, about which Mr. Churchill once opined, and melting into the night, many of them, some of them, a small number of them, but some of them, to re-emerge to harm us as happened in Liverpool just the other week. It's hard to believe that Mrs. Thatcher would have lost her grip in the way, grip of events, dear boy, events, to quote Mr. Macmillan again, in the way that Boris Johnson seems to have lost his grip of events.
Can I just put a counter narrative? And it's interesting you make the distinction between the oratorical flaws of yesterday, which actually a lot of his supporters may just think, well, that's so much flim-flam that people who are interested in politics care about. But actually, they do care about things like Brexit. They do care about things like migration. They do care about things like COVID. And I made the point earlier in the programme that actually, whisper this, although having made some howlers that cost lives at the beginning of this COVID crisis, there is an argument you can now make that actually under Boris Johnson, and it may not be his responsibility, maybe his civil servants and scientists and other ministers, but actually we're doing a pretty good job because of the AstraZeneca vaccine, because of the booster uptake, which is like no other pretty much country in the world, and the fact that we had this period in the summer when we let the virus rip. He deserves credit for that.
Well, not from me. I think the government's handling of the pandemic has been a catastrophe from the beginning. We were partly saved by the skill of our scientists, Oxford University, preeminent amongst them, our researchers, our biomedical science base did pull us for a time out of the hole, but there's now a tremendous lack of social peace and cohesion. The credibility of the state now is under question by very large numbers of people. You see some of these demonstrations, Colin. I'm not on them. I don't support them. But they're getting larger and larger. So I think that is one of the issues over which he's seen to have failed. The largesse, let's call it that for the sake of the lawyers, with which 10 scores of billions of pounds was handed out to, how shall I put it, companies that couldn't necessarily be guaranteed to perform the contracts that they were given and didn't, in some cases, perform, is one of the black marks on his exam paper. But there are many, many others. The refugee crisis shouldn't be underestimated. The scattering of thousands of people to three-star hotels up and down the land are all accidents waiting to happen. And the point I made earlier is, in a way, my main point, that beyond the Red Wall, on the Red Wall and beyond it, where Boris Johnson did so well, it's no accident that some of those, quite a number of them, new Tory MPs, first time ever Tory MPs in many constituencies, were not in the voting lobby with Boris Johnson yesterday. The knowledge that one is to be hanged in the morning, said Dr. Johnson, concentrates the mind wonderfully. And MPs know, metaphorically speaking, that in every general election, they're to be hanged.